The New York Times has finally, at long last, after 2 years, acknowledged that mask mandates do not work. I've been talking about this. If you watch this show, you know that I've been talking about it for a long time on this show. If you listen to Clay and Buck, you know that I've been talking about it for a long time there. If you listen to the Outkick the Coverage radio show, before I moved over to Clay and Buck, you know I've been talking about there. And certainly if you read my Twitter feed, my social media feeds, if you pay attention at all to Outkick itself, you know that I've been talking about this for a long time. This morning, I woke up, and in the New York Times, I read the following about mask mandates not working. You would think communities where mask wearing has been more common would have had many fewer COVID infections, but that hasn't been the case. In U.S. cities where mask use has been more common, COVID has spread at a similar rate as in mask-resistant cities. Mask mandates in schools also seem to have done little to reduce the spread. Again, I'm reading from the New York Times right now. The New York Times, after 2 years. Hong Kong, despite almost universal mask wearing, recently endured one of the world's worst COVID outbreaks. Advocates of mask mandates sometimes argue they do have a big effect, even if it isn't evident in the population-wide data, because of how many other factors are at play. But this argument seems unpersuasive. 2 years. 2 years now, I have been arguing that masks made no sense. I started it off, obviously, from a sports perspective. Do you remember when you could play football for an entire game and tackle each other on the field, but you couldn't shake hands after the game? Do you remember when basketball players would play basketball games and then put their masks on when they sat on the bench on the sidelines? Do you remember all of that ridiculousness that was going on? Have you paid attention to the fact that Steve Kerr is still wearing a mask on the sideline with the Golden State Warriors, even though he has it down around his chin? Mask mandates don't work. Masks have done virtually nothing to stop the spread of COVID at all. Do you remember last August when I went to my local school board and, as one of many parents did all over the country, stood in front of the school board and argued against an implementation of a mask mandate because the scientific data on it was clear and readily accessible and not in any way confusing. And that data showed us that masks made no difference whatsoever and that mask mandates made no one safer. Have you paid attention to all the arguments I've made about mask mandates on airplanes and at airports and at indoor facilities and everywhere else that it makes no sense? I've been arguing that for years. Now the New York Times has suddenly come on board with that argument. What's going on here? I think this is part and parcel of what will be a rapid change in the way that this talk occurs. I think you're already seeing it with kids in schools, which is people are arguing, oh yeah, remote learning was an oxymoron. Yes, kids were overwhelmingly deprived by being held out of school, but we didn't have any other choices or we didn't know any better. Right? Initially, the argument was, well, this is not going to be a major impact. And then you see the pivot, where the pivot suddenly becomes, well, yes, the data is clear, but we didn't have any other options. And then what will happen in the years ahead, and I'm just telling you exactly what's going to happen, is almost everyone will say, oh, yeah, we knew masks didn't work. Oh, yeah, we knew that keeping kids out of school was a bad idea. Oh, yeah, the social distancing stuff was ridiculous. I never believed in any of that. Remember what it's going to be like in the future. They're going to act like no one ever believed any of these things were necessary. And they probably will do it for vaccine mandates too. I want you to remember who was right about all this, who looked at the data, who constantly fought through even being called by our own Department of Justice domestic terrorist for having the audacity to point out that requiring 5-year-olds to wear masks all day made zero sense and wasn't making anyone safer. The New York Times has now admitted it. Now, the New York Times is trying to say, well, mask mandates don't work but masks do work, which is not logically reachable. And the way that they're trying to make that argument is they're saying, well, if everybody perfectly wore masks, and if everyone wore the right masks, and if everyone wore them and nobody ever ate and nobody ever drank and nobody was ever in close proximity to anybody else. So basically, if real life didn't exist, then they're arguing, oh, masks would work. Make no mistake. The data is clear. Masks do not have any impact at all from a statistical perspective. Now, this is significant because if you said this on Twitter, they would ban you. If you tried to share it on Facebook or Instagram, or even talked about it on your podcast, they would label that as a mistruth. It's amazing how many things that big tech has said are not true end up being true. And it's also incredible to me that the party of science, Democrats, the party of science, no one ever says to Joe Biden, hey, how come you continue to wear masks when the data overwhelmingly reflects that masks do nothing? Do you believe in science or do you not? Remember when Joe Biden arrived in South Korea and walked off the airplane wearing a mask and walked down the stairs and immediately took his mask off to shake hands? Did you see, thank God I don't live in Canada. Did you see Justin Trudeau speaking about guns and legislation that he was introducing? And every single politician behind him was wearing a stupid mask. Not even a big N95 mask, just those stupid, cheap hospital masks that do nothing. We've got an entire huge percentage of the American public that just chooses to believe things that are 100% not true as it pertains to masks. But I do appreciate the New York Times finally joining the crowd of people like me who've been called stupid red state rednecks who don't know any better, that have been looking at the data for 2 years now saying it makes no sense for anyone to be wearing a mask. And by the way, kids are still wearing masks in schools. Philadelphia, right now, probably some people watching and listening to me have kids going to school in Philadelphia. Kids are being required to wear masks. It's all madness. Makes zero sense.